Mirrors can be fun, and they are very useful. Ever noticed how many we use in our daily life, and just how many there are? From the moment we wake up, we use mirrors in all sorts of ways to help us adjust our hair or help us to shave. We use mirrors in places like the hairdresser to gain a view of the work they have done. And if we use two mirrors, we can gain yet a different perspective on that work. Mirrors are very useful. In our cars we use mirrors to help see behind us and avoid hazards, some of which magnify the view, and at the dentist we can see in places otherwise out of sight. Yes, mirrors are very useful.
Hello, I'm Derek Wenmoth. I live here in Christchurch, New Zealand, and very pleased to be part of the K-12 online conference. I'm currently the Director of e-learning at an organisation called Core Education here. It's a not-for-profit research and education organisation that has a particular interest in looking at the impact of ICT and technology on teaching and learning, leading towards a system-wide transformational change in what we're doing in the education system. I've been a professional educator now for more than 25 years as a teacher, a principal and as a teacher educator, and throughout that time I've developed a personal interest and passion, you might say, for how we use technology in all its forms to influence and impact on what we do in classroom teaching and learning. In New Zealand, our team at Core are responsible for the National Professional Development Program for teachers using ICT in their learning in both the school sector and in the early childhood sector. From this experience, we've learned a whole heap about what can be done and needs to be done to effectively improve and change our practice as educators as we seek to integrate technology into our classroom teaching and learning. So why start with mirrors? What have they got to do with ICT and education and professional practice? Well, the analogy here is that mirrors provide us with a reflection of ourselves and what we have around us. We use mirrors to modify the way we look, modify the way that we behave too. Think about the way a ballerina uses mirrors in a dance studio to get those movements absolutely perfect. So in the keynote now, I'd like to explore these ideas about the things that we use to provide a reflection of the way that we behave, the things that we say, and the characteristics of our teaching in the classroom with ICT. Reflecting on our own practice is particularly important as we're working in areas of uncertainty or change, such as the integration of technology into our teaching and learning. If we fail to make use of such mirrors in our lives, we risk never being sure of quite how our actions are affecting our students or how our plans for ICT use are actually working out in practice. The consequence is that we end up with our classrooms where we're simply doing a lot of the old things in new ways, where poor teaching with old technology is replaced by poor teaching with new technology. Think about the number of workshops or seminars that you've attended on things like, for instance, Web 2 technologies or handhelds in the classroom or even interactive whiteboards. You get excited about those, you see the potential, then you return to your classroom full of desks and textbooks. Or think about when you've been inspired by talks about collaboration, constructivism, creativity, or increased learner choice and personalisation, only to return to an environment where you're bound by high-stakes assessment and external standards. How can we close this gap between espoused theory and theory in use? We need to hold a mirror to our professional practice and begin reflecting on what we are doing. Not just navel-gazing reflection, but reflection that requires some critical thought and some structured and disciplined data gathering in order to provide us with the evidence that we need. If enough teachers do this, we'll not only see results at an individual classroom level, but also at a whole school and system-wide level, building from what is happening in classrooms with students and not relying on top-down standardised approaches that end up with stifling of innovation. Let me illustrate for a moment with an example from where I live, right here in New Zealand. We've had various forms of professional development for teachers using technology in classrooms since the early 1990s. And in 1998, we began what we call our cluster-based professional development program. Groups of schools submit a joint bid to a contestable fund to implement a professional development program focusing on the integration of ICT into their classroom practice. The caveats are that they have to apply for this as a cluster of schools, not an individual school, and the money must be spent on professional development activities. It can't be spent on hardware or infrastructure. A few years ago, I worked with a colleague of mine here at CORE, Dr. Vince Ham, and we undertook a 3-year research project in which we spent countless hours in classrooms observing teachers and students working with technology in their teaching and learning programs. In those classrooms, we repeatedly saw scenes like you're seeing now. Students engaged in a variety of learning activities using a variety of forms of ICT, with teachers taking different roles and different learning outcomes being measured. A common theme among the teachers we interviewed was the idea of integration. They were trying to see how they could get the ICTs to be a part of their classroom learning programs and not simply an end in themselves. Throughout our research, some big questions emerged. What is effective integration of technology, or ICT? And how can we ensure that what we're doing with ICT has educational value? And at the end of the day, what is educational value? You see, we saw lots and lots of things, and still do today, where teachers are picking up new technologies like blogs or wikis, or the use of Flickr or Delicious, or simply using word processors or PowerPoint displays in classrooms. The fascination of this technology is what drives that initial behaviour. But after a while, these questions we come back to. Is it making a difference? Is it contributing significantly to what we're learning and what we're teaching? And so we must take a time in our teaching and learning to reflect, to sit back and think about, is what we are intending to happen here actually happening? And are there other things, unintended things, actually occurring, which may in themselves provide ideas for where we could go next? Dr. Ham and I spent time in the classrooms with a schedule of observations that we were making. And these were the questions that we were really focusing on, looking to see what was the relationship between the ICT activity in the classroom and the curriculum goals set by the teacher. We looked for what the relationship was between the ICT activity and any of the other learning activities that were happening in the classroom. We also looked to see what was the relationship between the ICT activity and where the ICTs themselves were located, the physical location of those things. Fourthly, we looked at the relationship between the ICT activity and the pedagogical practices and understandings of the teacher and the learning styles, abilities and motivations of the students. And lastly, we looked to see what extent the ICTs were being taken for granted as appropriate media for teaching and learning. From our observations, it became evident that much of what was happening with the use of ICT in classrooms was determined in the first instance not by what the curriculum or pedagogical goals were, or any sets of externally imposed guidelines or standards, but by the values and beliefs, the educational philosophy, if you like, of the teachers. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But from our analysis of the data, my colleague Dr. Ham formulated what he calls his licorice strap that you can see here, defining 4 levels of maturity in terms of how ICTs are used in the classroom. The key thing here is the relationship between 2 things. On the one hand, the extent to which ICTs are taken for granted, something we've called ICT prominence. And the second is the relationship of the ICT use to the other things going on in the classroom, the curriculum, the pedagogy and other class activity, something that we've called connectedness. You can see these things woven together in the diagram on the screen. As the relationship between these 2 variables changes, there are 4 clearly identifiable levels of maturity that can be observed. The first of these things we called addition. Now, in the classrooms where this was the case, the ICT was being used as the complete focus. There was no connection to thinking or learning or to pedagogy or curriculum really at all. The ICT was the overriding focus. The computer activity was usually separated in time and place from other learning, and the overall emphasis simply on use per se. An example of this would be where students are taken to a computer lab purely to learn the skill of word processing or to use PowerPoint, or in a classroom where the student is focusing on learning a particular skill, maybe through a drill and practice program at the back of the classroom. So the overall use is an additive one to what's happening in the curriculum. The second of the levels was called incorporation. Now, in these classrooms, the ICT was still pretty much separated from the rest of the curriculum activity, but there was some level of connection beginning to develop. So an example in this classroom might be where students are engaged in a maths or writing activity, for example, but in the back of the classroom a student is working on a computer, also doing a writing activity, maybe connected, maybe not, and there would generally be a roster on the wall where students would take their turn at the computer as distinct from the rest of the class activity. The third stage is one we call integration, and this is what teachers generally tried to explain to us they were working towards in their classrooms. In these classrooms there was some level of ICT consciousness still present, but a high degree of connectedness to the ICT activity. And so teachers in these classrooms would be characterised where a research project, for instance, may be undertaken, and so in the background would be a computer linked to the internet to assist with that research. Or students may be involved in some sort of presentation activity, and so they are creating some form of slideshow or web-based presentation that they can show their colleagues later. The overall emphasis in these classrooms is then on appropriate use. The fourth phase was one that we called assimilation, and this was really a move on from integration to where the emphasis on the ICT or the technology use now has almost disappeared, and where it is an invisible part of what is happening as a natural part of the learning activity in the classroom. There's a high but subconscious connectedness between the ICT use and the curriculum, if you like. The computer activity here is embedded in the long-term structure of learning, and the emphasis here is on spontaneous use and student choice. In these classrooms we saw a lot of evidence of students making their own decision about when and how to integrate the use of technology, and in many of these cases students had access to technology outside of classroom hours that they naturally used. In many of our interviews with teachers, we found them to be very interested in what they were doing and had a lot to say about that. But although they had well-developed ideas about what they were attempting to achieve and why they were doing this in their classrooms, many were less clear about how well they were doing, or indeed what effect the use of the technology actually was having. And often our observations of what they were doing varied from their claims of what they were doing. Different teachers explained their use of ICT for different reasons. For some, they saw it as important for the development of skills for employment, or, if you like, the economic imperative. Others saw that they wanted to use ICT across all of the subjects they were teaching, the curriculum imperative. Yet others saw ICT as helping foster higher order thinking and creativity, the learning imperative. Some saw ICTs as a sort of Trojan horse, a way of introducing change and innovation through the back door in their schools, the pedagogical change imperative. And there were those who thought that the appeal lay in the excitement of new technologies and tended to do new things in new ways, the innovation imperative. And lastly, there were others committed to the idea of making the use of ICT invisible in their classroom program, which was an attitudinal imperative. But one thing is clear: the assimilation of ICT usage into the daily practices of classroom teaching and learning has created a number of challenges for the way that we organise and manage student learning. Now, if you like, the landscape of our practices of using ICT in our classrooms is often creating a tension between two things. The first of these is our core beliefs, our understandings that we hold about teaching and learning, our educational philosophy, if you like. The second thing is the pragmatics of the systems and the infrastructure that we operate in, and the actions we take based on our own hunches and intuition, if you like, as teachers. The extent to which our educational philosophy is part of our conscious work as teachers, or simply implicit in what we do, is likely to determine the dominance of one of these influences over the other in what actually happens in our classrooms. There always is an ongoing tension between these two influences. Any change to the status quo in our classrooms creates a challenge to our philosophical beliefs and ideas. But in the absence of any explicit philosophical basis for action or decision making, it'll be the pragmatic influences that take over. As a response to this dilemma, Dr. Ham and I used what we learned from our research to create an online tool that we've called an educational positioning system. This tool is designed as a self-evaluative instrument by which teachers can map their practice in terms of technology use for teaching and learning against the landscapes of their pedagogical belief and technological infrastructure. We see this being used to help teachers come to some judgment about the educational value of their ICTs with classes and the extent to which they are effectively assimilating ICTs within the broader culture of effective teaching and powerful learning. This online tool varies from many of the other sort of checklists that we have seen in two significant ways. The first is that it focuses teachers' attention on one area of their practice rather than asking them to measure themselves against a set of criteria that's been determined externally or by somebody else. The second thing is that instead of representing back to the teacher the results of this analysis in some sort of numerical or statistical way, it presents the information back in the form of a map from which the teacher can make their own interpretations about their position in the educational landscape and then make some decisions about the professional learning that they may want to make or embark on from there. In using this tool, teachers start off by completing a series of questions that inquire about their personal beliefs and understandings about teaching and learning. It then goes on to ask for responses to questions relating to a specific instance or instances of teaching and learning with ICT in their class. There's a lot of reflective thought required simply in making these sorts of responses, but at the end of the process, the teacher is rewarded with this map of their current ICT practice. Now, each of the features on the landscape of this map represents an aspect of what must be considered when we're thinking about how we use our ICTs in teaching and learning. The mountains at the back represent our beliefs about teaching and learning, our teaching disposition or philosophy. A flag flies on the particular mountain that represents the teacher based on what his or her responses are. The river that flows from these mountains represents what we actually do with ICTs, our practice. Our philosophy must be continually fed by the rains of professional development and reflective practice so that there's plenty of water flowing down our river of practice, keeping it deep and wide and far. The rocks that impede, or may not in some cases, impede the flow of the river represent the infrastructural impediments that sometimes limit what we do, things like poor bandwidth or lack of computer access in the classroom, for instance. The tributaries that flow at the end of the river represent the extent to which we're using ICTs in all areas of the curriculum. For a primary or elementary teacher, there may be lots of tributaries as they teach all areas of the curriculum. But for a subject specialist in secondary, there may only be one or two tributaries, since their focus is likely to be more narrow. The trees and the shrubs at the end represent the learning outcomes. These trees may be tall and bushy, or they may be short and shrubby, depending on how well the outcomes are achieved. Our map shows trees in different colours to represent the different outcomes of higher order thinking, creativity and student engagement. Now, the purpose of the EPS, as we have called it, is to expose this connectedness between our practices on the one hand and the influences of our beliefs and the pragmatics of the circumstances that we're teaching in on the other. The goal here is to move towards a more explicit articulation of philosophy that in turn becomes the source and can be mapped against our river of practice. The maps that are showing now show the variables that can be represented here. This one shows what happens when a teacher with a very structured approach to his or her teaching experience has a lot of infrastructural impediments resulting in poor outcomes. You can see the low bushy shrubs. This one could well be that of a subject specialist in a senior secondary area who is focused on achieving a very specific set of outcomes and succeeds despite those very large rocks in the way. The third map reveals a teacher where there's no connection at all between the espoused philosophy and their river of practice, and as a result, the outcomes are poor despite there being very few infrastructural impediments. Sooner or later, as you can see, that river's going to dry up because the rains of professional development and reflective practice that fall on the mountains of their philosophy isn't connected to the flow. Now, each of these maps provides a teacher with an opportunity to critically reflect on what's been revealed and to think about the range of factors and influences that may have led to this particular map being represented in this way. So, based on their reaction and their conclusion, they're able to set some professional learning goals for themselves based on the changes they'd like to see on their map. And so, it is more of a reflective tool than it is a measurement tool. And so, in a simple but I think very effective way, the EPS and the map that it generates becomes one of the mirrors that a teacher can hold to his or her professional practice. And in the same way we use mirrors to help us adjust our hair, if we have any, or our clothes, or to gain a perspective from behind or so forth, the EPS map provides us with the basis for considering the adjustments to our practice through a whole scale of things. So think about what I said before about being introduced to things like a blog or a wiki and how you have attempted to introduce those to your classrooms. Just what have you done to make the connection back now to the intentions that you had with their use and the understandings that you have about how effective they are in achieving those intentions? Of course, the EPS is only one of the mirrors that we can hold to our professional practice. The important thing is that it illustrates the value of using our own experience as the starting point of the reflective process. As my colleague Dr. Vince Ham explains here.
The reasons why we built in the specific activity was to get teachers reflecting on their actual practice, because there's a tendency in the interviews for them to generalise according to what they felt they wanted to represent. But by putting the questions in that made them address an individual learner addressing an individual ICT activity, made them really focus on what they actually did in the classroom and what their practice actually was, as opposed to what they would like it to be, and asking questions about that. And that's at the basis of all self-reflection and self-study and evidence-based inquiry, really, is the honest, detailed, planned and deliberate look at what it is that you do, and critical look at what it is that you do in the classroom and what it is that the kids are doing in the classroom. So all the work on reflection on ICTs in classroom that we've done with the fellows, with the EPS, with the observations from the ICTPD clusters and so forth, it's all giving us some principles about what works and what doesn't in terms of reflective practice. And it's more than just thinking about what I did yesterday. It's got to have those other components in it. It's got to have those components of self-challenge, self-critique, self-inquiry, and planned ongoing collection of data. So it's for those reasons we've come to the conclusion that reflection is really important, but reflection is not done in a short amount of time. It's not done without challenge and discomfort. And it's not done alone.
So there you have it. Reflection is not a matter of a few quick thoughts over a cup of coffee. For reflection to be really useful to us as practitioners, it's going to require time, it's going to require a level of challenge, and it'll require others to work with us as mentors or guides or co-reflectors, if you like. At CORE, we've had the privilege of supervising the National E-Fellows program since it started here in New Zealand. An E-Fellowship is awarded to just a small number of teachers in New Zealand each year. They are released from their classroom teaching for that whole year, or most of it, to undertake an intensive period of action research in an area that's of real interest to them, generally something that's part of their own professional practice. Their program has been designed based on the principles that Vince referred to, and here are some of the things that our current group of E-Fellows have to say about their experience.
For me, the fellowship has been the opportunity to have time out and to do one thing properly. And this year we've had that luxury, been able to reflect and been able to interact with the other E-Fellows to bring some robustness into your reflection.
It's given me, this is the old cliche, it's given me time to think. But it's just not time to think, it's actually time to talk to peers and actually read other, or be open to other thoughts and other people coming in with ideas which I hadn't been aware of before.
For me, the value of the fellowship is actually spending time with other people. Definitely have more time to think, but you can only think what's in your own head. But when you've got other people around you, they can expand on what you're currently thinking and take you down new avenues that you would never have gone down before.
Fellowship for me has been about growth of horizons, and by that I mean where I can go, where my students go, where the technology can go, and the way that's happened, I think, is in the fellowship itself, just relating to and with the fellows. So it's been exponential growth.
I think the fellowship for me has just given me a chance to have a really good think about how things are at our school and in our little town. Just being involved with everyone else in the fellowship, it's given me a good opportunity to see what other schools are doing and give them an opportunity to see what our school's doing.
So the value of reflection for me is also having time to reflect with other people. I think it's the collaboration with others that really has broadened my depth of knowledge and taken me outside my comfort zone.
The old thing is that teachers are too busy to take time to reflect, but the value of it is so important in terms of actually looking at your progress with children, with students, and actually moving forward from there. And if we don't, I think it's morally incumbent upon us to actually reflect.
Well, for me it was understanding what co-construction is and how I can apply that in the classroom and how it can be applied in an online environment. And once I was able to understand that, or at least have a little bit of understanding of that, it gave me greater certainty about what I was doing at the time, thinking about what is learning and what is knowledge. Because they're the things that we're here to do, and unless you can really understand what they are, you're wasting your time.
The reason that we started this research project was because we could see learning happening in our classroom, but we needed the time to reflect, to actually gather data that the learning was happening. So we had more time to find out that it, to prove that it was happening.
The fellowship's been about actually understanding the context that the whole ICT problem we've got sits in. Before the fellowship, I understood the little domain that I was working in, but the area beyond didn't really exist. And if it sort of peeked its head up now and again, I didn't see where it fit. But now I've got almost like a map, or sort of like a slightly foggy map of where things are.
But on reflection, looking back over my teaching, by using ICT in the classroom, my whole pedagogy has changed. I've gone from being a teacher up front to being, ICT only works in the classroom when you've got a supportive, collaborative environment. So my reflection would be that by introducing ICT, I've actually overhauled my entire teaching pedagogy.
Now, researchers in this area have argued for a long time that the keys to teacher change lie in the deeper cultural, discursive and institutional context in which PD occurs, and the progress of professional learning programs as socio-professional events and processes. And they argue that we have to be implementing professional development models defined not in the short-term transfer of information, the handy hints or skills for individual teachers. We have to look at professional development programs that are defined in the long-term facilitation of cultures of self-inquiry, critical reflection, and the self-renewal of whole school programs. If there's something that I'd like to contribute to the discussion in this conference, it would be for us to be more earnestly engaging and reflecting on what we are doing, what it is that we're achieving through our ICT use in education. We need more teachers who can move past the hype and the enthusiasm of being innovators and the early adopters, and who can feel free to act outside the immediate constraints of the externally imposed standards and guidelines that we're all affected by, whatever country we're in. And we need those who can stand with integrity and stand up and defend their practice in terms of the evidence and the outcomes that they have from these reflections, and not simply because of what someone else has told them they need to be doing. Everywhere I look, I see the need for this in education. We talk long and hard about using ICT to foster creativity and collaboration, but we continue to test completion and comprehension. We talk about using ICTs to open up the world to the learner, but we continue to teach in confined, closed walls of the classroom. And we talk about ICTs enabling transformational change, but we're satisfied with small, faltering steps, mostly not scalable or unsustainable. We talk about the way that ICTs can empower learners to be more participative, inquiring and self-determining, yet we continue to be constrained by the unyielding curriculum and assessment regimes. You don't need to feel that this is something you've got to tackle alone. Sharing ideas with your peers and colleagues is one of the most powerful ways of gaining this reflective insight. Having a professional mentor, for instance, is an important strategy for successful reflecting on your practice. And this is where technology can be really useful. Think about it. One of the reasons that the social networking sites have become so successful is that they provide a forum for this sort of sharing, creating deeper levels of affirmation and self-awareness. A blog, for example, provides an effective way of diarying your learning journey and providing others with the opportunity to comment. Not forgetting, of course, that you and your comments on other people's blogs are very important to them. The sorts of common interest communities that are developing in environments like Bebo, MySpace, Facebook and the like are all important here, as the environments that allow you to set up your own community spaces are, such as ELG and Ning. So perhaps one of the actions that you might like to consider as a result of participating in this conference would be to begin either setting up your own blog or your own community space, or simply going and visiting those of others and participating fully in the discussions that are taking place there. So as a way of summarising and prompting you to think more about what you can do as a result of what you heard in my keynote, I'd like to pose these questions to you. What are the mirrors that you are holding to your professional practice? Now, who are the mentors that you relate to on a regular basis? Those who actually visit your classroom and provide feedback to you on your teaching. What is the professional reading that you do that keeps you stimulated and informed? What communities of practice do you belong to, whether online or face-to-face? What about your blog? Where is that? Or the place that you record your thoughts and ideas and reflections? And what about the RSS feeds that you are subscribed to, and with whom do you discuss these? When did you last visit someone else's classroom to observe and feedback on what you saw? And when did you last present at a workshop or at a staff meeting or conference and expose your practice and ideas to the scrutiny of others? Think about these things and act on the one that's most appropriate to you. For those of you who have made it to this point, thank you for watching and listening. And to the organisers of the K-12 conference, thanks for inviting me to participate. I've really appreciated the opportunity to do this and look forward to reading the thoughts and ideas of others online. For more details about the sorts of things that I do and my colleagues at CORE, you can find them here.